So this is the final video in my Canada series. Now we're getting to the end. Now we're getting to the early months of 2020. The onset of COVID-19, the pandemic. So I imagine, like most people, at the time when stories in the news started to break out about the whole province, or was it the city of Wuhan? I forget, but the whole of Wuhan had been put under lockdown by the Chinese government. There were reports coming in that the virus was becoming more and more widespread, but I didn't really pay any attention to it because we'd had pandemics before. Things like bird flu, swine flu, SARS. So I honestly didn't think it was much to be worried about. And I do remember at the time, I was actually, when I was answering the switchboard, when I was operating the switchboard, sometimes I would get potential guests calling and asking if our resort was going to be closing down, or if we were going to be closing some of our facilities. And back then I scoffed at the very idea. I had no idea that just a few months later, or just a few weeks later, I think it must have been in January or February, suddenly the whole country would be under lockdown, and most countries would be put under lockdown. But that's basically what happened. And now we're getting to early March, late February, early March of 2020. By this time, there were emails being circulated around the resort, and all of us were being briefed on the situation by our managers, who were explaining to us, we're going to be cutting down on all non-essential workers. So you're now going to be presented with two choices. For those of you who work on the front desk, or those of you who work in housekeeping or things like that, you now have two choices. Either you can choose to be let go, or you can do, what was it that they said that we would do? Was it things like painting, or I think it was something to do that there were these manual labor type tasks that they wanted us to do, and they offered us a choice between either doing that, staying employed with the resort but doing manual labor jobs, or being let go. And I chose to be let go because I really couldn't see myself enjoying something like that. You see, after the many months, I think it was 9 or 10 months in total that I'd spent living in Canada, most of it working, I was well and truly burnt out. Because all the hours that I put into working, all the hours that I spent standing up on my own 2 feet, because for some reason with most low-paid unskilled jobs, they just don't seem to think you should be allowed to have a seat. And it just seems to be a universal law. For some reason, no matter where you are, if you're a minimum wage worker or a wagey, an unskilled worker, you're just not allowed to sit down on a seat for most of your shift. You haven't unlocked that privilege yet. And all the hours that I spent on my own 2 feet, being bored out of my mind with nothing happening, or on the other hand, being flustered and overwhelmed at the sheer volume of customers that I was dealing with, the numbness and the brought about by the repetition of my tasks and the fact that, and the Sisyphean, what's the right word for this? The Sisyphean nature of what I was doing, in that I was earning a certain amount of money each month, but a good chunk of that money, half of it would go to either tax or towards my accommodation, and the other half would just be blown out on things like food, basic necessities, or I would just have those evenings where I was so flustered and overwhelmed I needed to distract myself, so I'd go out and have a drink or order a takeaway, because that's the kind of person I am. It felt like a lot of the time I was just a hamster in a wheel. The more you run, the faster the wheel goes. So at that point, I no longer really saw the point in working just for the sake of working. But even I talked about how in my last two videos I was worried, I was anxious for many months that I was going to lose my job at the resort because of that manager that I was working for, which did eventually happen, but the circumstances under which it happened were totally different to how I imagined. It was a lot more reassuring because, first of all, I wasn't being fired or let go for something I did. Everyone was getting fired. Like 2/3 of all our staff and service personnel were getting let go. And it wasn't personal. It wasn't down to malice. It wasn't down to a spiteful rumor or a comment that somebody else had made about me. Most of the staff, not everyone mind, but most of them were very kind and supportive and understanding, and they were reluctant to let go of all the staff and lock down the resort. But when the order came in from Prime Minister Trudeau, when the orders came in that we would have to close down and lock down on this and that, when I started to notice that all the shelves in all the local grocery stores were missing things like toilet paper and bathroom utensils, it really began to set in that things were changing. The world was changing, and to that end, I felt relieved, I felt calm, because for once, it wasn't my fault. And I guess that's why I didn't melt down and feel devastated when I lost my job. I felt like I'd done my service, and basically, nature was setting a different course for me. Like, it had been decided somehow that my experience working for the resort and in Canada, was to come to an end. So around this time, I was having a lot of phone calls and video calls with my mum and dad, who were living back in the UK. And at the time, the UK had not officially gone under lockdown, but it was certainly on the cards. Because at the time, I think Boris Johnson was facing increasing pressure from his own cabinet and from people in the media telling him, we can't pursue herd immunity as a policy. People will die in the thousands. You're evil if you don't lock the country down. And it's funny to think, even at the time, I didn't think that the virus was that serious. But here I was, reading story after story of how hundreds of thousands of casualties, everyone was at risk, all these countries were going under lockdown. So, and I explained my situation with mum and dad, and we all came to the agreement that it would be best if I just returned back home and ended it there and then. And I figured, well, I might as well do that. I stuck it out here for as long as I could. I did the best job I could. I would have liked to have explored more of Canada. I certainly there were things I wanted to do, things I wanted to go and see, but whatever reason, it just wasn't possible for me. And it certainly wouldn't have been possible for me to go around exploring the rest of the country now, at that time. Especially considering I didn't have any money left because I was, as I said, living from paycheck to paycheck. And if I couldn't earn any more money, I couldn't afford to live on the on-site accommodation, I couldn't afford to eat anything, which would have meant I'd been kicked out, and then I'd have been homeless in -20, -30 degrees Celsius. So it was a no-brainer. Obviously, I would be flying back home. So that's what happened. I took the Greyhound bus 100 miles south, down to Toronto again, hopped on a plane, bound for, I think it was London Gatwick, or London Heathrow, whichever one of them. And I was back home again. And that was the end of my 10-month stint living and working abroad in Canada as a British immigrant. And this would be the start of the world under the pandemic months, or the pandemic year. Yeah, that's right. It was, how long did the first lockdown last? Not sure if I remember. I think it must have gone on for at least as long as until July or August, but I do remember, I think I remember at around August this time, yes, we were going off to visit our grandparents who lived on the Isle of Wight. So I think the restrictions had somewhat eased by that time, but for the most part we would be living under lockdown. And you know, the funny thing is about the lockdown, a lot of people talk about the lockdown and they describe it as a catastrophe for people's mental health and the economy. And that's one thing that a lot of political commentators seem pretty much united on. The lockdown, it was a waste of money. We closed down the economy. Lots of businesses had shut up. People were isolated. People were lonely, living in their houses. No one was able to go out and visit their friends or their relatives. But the funny thing is, I actually felt kind of different about it. The lockdown was it was very refreshing for me because I didn't really have a lot of friends anyway. Most of the friends I had, they existed online, and I only communicated with them online anyway. I didn't have any IRL friends. Nobody who I hung out with on the regular. I was burned out of working shitty minimum wage jobs. So I didn't really fancy the idea that I was no longer legally able to go out and get a job. Well, I found that a relief. I mean, it's not, obviously, it wasn't ideal. I mean, there were still all kinds of restrictions on things you couldn't do. Like, for instance, you couldn't leave the house except for certain times in the day. There were only shops that were open. Oh yeah, no restaurants or pubs were open for certain periods of time, and that's the thing that bothered me, because I liked going out for a drink or going out to eat stuff, and that's one thing that I missed. But I did take a lot of solitary walks outside, and Fortunately, I didn't encounter any of those, those proverbial types who see it, those prefect types who would see a person walking outside under lockdown and say, "Hey you, I'm going to report you for being a granny killer," or something like that. So I had a lot of free time on my hands. But I should stress this, I should make this important. It was refreshing and fun for a little while, but eventually, as the lockdown dragged on, and especially by the time we'd entered our second lockdown, which was from late 2020 to early 2021, I was beginning to get a little sick and tired of it. And it was puzzling as to why were all unanimously, all of our governments had decided we're going to close down the whole economy, the whole country, in spite of the fact that immigration hadn't gone down for some reason, even though we decided we could shut down our national economy. We couldn't shut down our borders, which is something I found rather peculiar. But also, Sweden, the entire time, I don't know if you're aware of this, Sweden, so I hear, had not gone under lockdown. And there's no evidence, as far as I'm aware, so as to say that Sweden's mortality rate from the virus was any higher than any of ours. So it did seem like the narrative surrounding the virus was a little overblown, and it was beginning to get a little tiresome by the end of the second lockdown. And another thing that I should make abundantly clear is I was getting so sick and tired of wearing those stupid masks. They were uncomfortable. They made you look stupid. They didn't serve any practical use. There's no evidence to say that they stop you from spreading, contaminating the air with the virus. The good news is, though, if you wanted to rob a bank, then it would help prevent you from getting caught, so there was that. And especially, a problem I remember having with those masks is that they made my ears sore. And also, because my eyesight isn't that good, yes, my eyesight has never been that good. I'm minus 3.5 in my left eye and minus 4.25 in my right, according to my current prescription. But yeah, I wear contact lenses, but when I'm too lazy to wear contact lenses, I wear glasses. And what I found would happen is every time I entered a building with glasses and with a mask, my glasses would get fogged up with vapor from the air that I was breathing into my mask. And this would happen every time I entered a building. It was really, really infuriating. So I gotta say, while I found the lockdown quite refreshing and calming, it was quite new and exciting for a bit, I was beginning to get sick and tired of the lockdown in its final months, and I didn't really miss it when we were finally easing off all restrictions. But anyway, now getting back to, now that we're wrapping up the series, my overall thoughts on my trip to Canada. Was it worth it? What was it that I had set out to do? What did I believe I was there to accomplish when I set out on my trip to go to Canada? Did it turn out the way that I planned? Did I get everything I could out of it, and would I consider doing it again? It's really hard to say, because I don't quite know if I can put into exact words. Sorry. I don't know if I'm good at articulating what it was that I hoped to achieve when going out to Canada. It was a bunch of things. It was a myriad of things. In a nutshell, I wanted an adventure. I wanted to live in a foreign country, in a foreign environment, away from my house, away from the comfort and the security of my home. I wanted to be purely responsible for my own finances, my own budgeting. I wanted to put myself in a position where I was a responsible adult, living within my means, being in situations where I would have to use my own wits and my own social skills and so on to survive. I wanted to prove that it was possible for me. I wanted to experience a different culture. And in some cases, this part here would be bordering on idealistic fantasy, but part of me wanted to fall in love with a beautiful Canadian woman and marry her. Obviously, that didn't happen. I had a date. There was that, I guess. But that didn't go anywhere. And I left. I returned back home materially much poorer than I was when I'd set out. So, financially speaking, I incurred a huge loss. But you can't make judgments about things like this based purely on profit and loss, because humans aren't always driven by profit motives. There are deep psychological needs that we as young men have for wanting to go and explore another country. And in my case, what appealed to me, it was the notion of independence, the notion of pulling up stakes and living in a foreign environment, doing my own thing, being independent. That's something that I've always strived for. I guess I did enjoy a taste of that. I certainly gave it a shot. Did the best I could. It's a shame that it ended that soon. It certainly didn't go as I planned it would. But then, looking back, is it really fair to say that I had a plan in the first place? All sorts of things happened that I couldn't, as a rule, I could not have anticipated. Like, I didn't think it would be cheap finding a place to live in Toronto, but did I realize that I would spend months searching before I found a place to settle down? Did I realize that I would lose my job just like that at my first job? I mean, did I realize that it would be in any way disorienting and, what's the phrase? Disconnecting for me to live in a big city in a foreign country? I never gave these things any real thought. But these are all things that I can only talk about in hindsight now that I've experienced and seen it and witnessed it for myself. And since then, I have this little maxim that I've picked up in life. It's that, as a rule, you're not allowed to hate something until you've tried it at least once. So I don't regret the fact that I tried it and experienced it. I regret that it turned out the way it did. You know, I wished it turned out differently. I wished I'd done better. I wished I'd worked harder and complained less. But I can't change that. So I don't really think it's fair to blame myself for all those things either, because all you can do is your best. You do your best, and that's all you can do. And I certainly gave it a shot. I wasn't idle. I never asked my parents for money unless I really needed it, unless they offered it to me without me asking them. And it just didn't, and I could theoretically, I could have chosen, once the lockdown restrictions were eased, I could have chosen to fly back there and continue. But what would have been the point? It would have meant more of the same. There would have been very little avenues for upward mobility. It's certainly unlikely that I would have been promoted to a position like manager or anything like that. I would have had to have worked years for that to happen. And did I want to stick out the rest of my 20s in that resort, being a manager of some little-known resort in a small town in South Ontario? Not really. It's hard for me to look back on what benefits or what positive experiences I took from this 9 to 10 month extended stay. But the only substantial qualitative difference I can say between now and back then is that I have done it. I've experienced and tried it. In the past I didn't, and now I have. Maybe I didn't acquire any skills. Maybe I didn't earn a lot of money doing it. And maybe I felt burnt out, pessimistic, and cynical at the end of it. Maybe I had a go at romance and that fell through, and maybe there was a time where I was really up against it and seriously considering ending my own life. But all in all things considered, I don't regret doing it. I needed it. I needed to visit another country. I needed to get that wanderlust out of my system. I don't really have an especially strong desire to do it again now, mainly because for all practical purposes it's just not feasible. My desire to be independent is still there, except that too isn't really feasible, especially not given the way things are now. I fear that the older I'm getting, the more burnt out and exhausted I'm becoming at the futility of my situation. The fact that I used to have dreams and fantasies of upward mobility when I was in my early 20s. I used to have appetite and ambition. And now that I'm 30, I no longer have those dreams and fantasies because I've exhausted myself chasing after them. So instead what's happening is I'm learning steadily to detach myself from things like dreams of success and material pursuits, and with women. Maybe I'll get better at coping in the future with not having those things. Maybe. I'm not sure. Anyway, that's more or less everything I wanted to say about my Canada experience. I did it because I wanted to be independent. I did it because I wanted to experience a different culture. And yes, I'd say I achieved both of those things. And no, I don't regret doing it. I only regret the way it turned out. But it wasn't my fault that it turned out the way it did. So that's about everything. This is probably going to be my longest ever video series so far, but anyway, There was a lot that I had to talk about, and that about does it. Anyway, this has been Tracking. Thank you guys for sticking along with me throughout this video series, and thanks to Benjamin Haywood for asking me to make this video series. I hope I've been able to answer and satisfy your curiosity if you're watching this. Anyway, I'm probably going to make more relevant topics about day-to-day stuff in the future now that I've finished this. Anyway, in the meantime, I got to finish my collection route. So you guys take care, alright? This has been Tracking. I'll see you guys later. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.